Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm starting promptly at 12 because I respect your time and I'm so excited for our speakers who are here and also everyone who is in attendance with us today. I am just briefly going to tell you how the format is going to go this afternoon because I know that we want our time dedicated to our wonderful speakers who have joined us, and you want to gain the knowledge that they have to share with us today. So Dr. Vitek is going to go first. She has a presentation that she is going to share with us, and then Dr. Silverman will present after her. If you can hold your questions until after their presentations, we will have a Q&A sessions directly after Dr. Silverman is done. If you would like to go ahead and submit a question into the chat, that is fine as well. I understand that sometimes you just want to get it out while you think of it. So please feel free to put them in the chat and they will be addressed during the question and answer. So again, I hope you find this as valuable as I have every time I've got to hear them speak. And so Dr. Vitek, I'm going to stop sharing so then you can share your screen and whenever you're ready.
Okay. And you can see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to join this webinar today. So I'm going to be talking about a presentation I'm going to go through as quickly as I can to leave time for questions on ethical considerations for pervasive data research. So, I am at the University of Maryland, College Park, and I'm a privacy and ethics researcher. I've been doing research in this space for about 12 years. I'm most interested in looking at the risks of new technologies that are being introduced, including a lot of the AI that has emerged in the last decade, thinking about ethical guidelines to help researchers doing this, what types of risk consumers experience. And a lot of the ethical focused research has been done by this group called PERVADE, or Pervasive Data Ethics for Computational Research. Back in 2017, we received NSF funding, and we ran, as you can see, there are 7 co-PIs on this project, ran until 2023. And this past year, in 2024, 3 of us obtained new funding since the old grant had ended. And in this new grant that just got started in the fall, we're really focused on ethics education resources for computer science and data science students and educators. And noting here, one of the things we're looking at is responsible and ethical conduct of research training that happens at U.S. institutions. So the first thing I want to get out of the way is, what do we mean by pervasive data? So this is something that the way we have been framing this project for the last 8 years or so. Pervasive data we define as rich personal information generated through digital interaction and available for computational analysis. So this is a little bit different than previous framings when we would talk a lot about big data. But this is when we think about pervasive data research, so what are the people who are doing this type of research doing? They're gathering digital data about people. They're using some form of computational methods. It doesn't need to be super advanced, but some way of analyzing to understand individuals or groups' health, habits, routines, or beliefs. And frequently, this data collection is happening without awareness of the studied population. So there's a lot of data scraping that happens, and a lot of research that's published in that space, which is the most obvious example of this. I'm very excited that this is caught on as a term. And so this is a screenshot from the Federal Register. And just earlier this week, they closed a period for public comments. This was something put out by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and they were looking for comments on ethical guidelines for research using pervasive data. If you look at the summary there at the bottom, they're trying to develop non-binding guidelines to help researchers who are doing research in this space, which more and more people are doing research in this space every year. So what are we, as the Pervade team, what have we been researching? We focus a lot on how changes in both the data that's available and how data can be analyzed, how that's changing a lot of our fundamental ethical assumptions. So I've listed 4 things here: the risks within the data itself, beliefs and opinions in user communities, beliefs and practices in the research communities, and practices among regulators and policymakers, including IRBs. And so if you look back over the last 10 years, we've been publishing across all 4 of these areas. Our newest grant is really focused on number 3. And the reason why I find this so fascinating is because that I think the AI, pervasive data, big data, if you just look back on the last decade, algorithms, all of these things have been creating this tremendous gray area when we're thinking about ethics. So, going back to the Belmont principles, the common rule, that was a very different interpretation of what research was. And a lot of that I don't think necessarily works or applies or is as easy of a fit as it might have been with more traditional research. So here are several questions that I think get raised when we think about this type of data. Informed consent is something that comes up very frequently. Is it even possible or feasible for you to get informed consent at scale? Questions about whether public data is actually public and what does that mean? Transparency in research, so what should researchers be telling people? Should they be allowing people to contact them and have their data removed? What does that look like? Those types of things. Who's being left out by data collection strategies? So there's a ton of research that, for example, Twitter researchers over the last 10 plus years would collect a bunch of tweets and they would come to some conclusion as if that was generalizable. Obviously, people who use Twitter, it's not representative of everyone. And, there's lots of questions. Obviously, marginalized communities are frequently left out in data collections, and that creates its own big set of problems. Questions around anonymization. And so a lot of this speaks to data sharing. And can you actually anonymize a data set? What are the risks to sharing data? And then questions, obviously, about AI as part of research. So I was on a HHS panel in the fall where we talked about this a lot, and mainly in the health context, and how AI can actually be really beneficial to research, but also raising a lot of these privacy and ethics questions about it as well. So a lot of the research that I have done in this space has not been directly on AI, but a lot more around things like mobile, wearables, social media, things like that. So I figured I would focus in the next couple minutes on mobile health data, which I think is something that raises a ton of ethical questions. So when we're thinking about this type of data, the easiest way of framing it is within this quantified self movement, which has been around since before a lot of these technologies were around. And quantified self is very much about using self-tracking to learn about yourself and improve yourself. So this could be things like inputs, food, symptoms, states, your mood, your location, your performance mentally or physically. And here's an analog tracking system, somebody who is doing bullet journaling to track themselves. But obviously there are tons of technologies now that can help you to track data at a very, very granular data, can potentially be performing analyses on, but also that you're sharing potentially sensitive data with third parties. So wearables like watches, there's like health rings, all these types of things are collecting continuous real-time health inputs, and they're able to synthesize this data. They can often give some type of output to the users. And mobile apps can be really, really helpful for people who are doing research when they're paired with smart technologies to give the researchers and potentially the end user rich and detailed data in situ. So let's talk about a couple examples of this. Apple Watch is one of the most popular smartwatches out there, but there are lots of other ones that are out there, and it can collect a wide range of data from a person. So the most obvious is things like steps, but also sleep, nutrition, various health data points, and vitals, and track it over an extended period of time. Apple has a health app that will create visualizations for the user about this. Disease management is another area in which this is very, very common. So diabetes tracking is one that has really advanced, I would say, in recent years. So you can have mobile apps that are paired with an on-body glucose monitor to track in real time your glucose levels and any type of insulin treatment that you're doing. Here's one I use, Migraine Buddy, which allows you to track migraine symptoms over time, try to identify triggers. One of my big areas of research is actually in smart home technology, so I think about smart home devices very frequently, and they are increasingly being framed in terms of being used to increase health and well-being. And so one example of this in the image is the Amazon Echo Show. And so this is you're probably familiar with the Amazon Echoes and their various speaker devices, and so this is a version of it with a screen. It has a very interesting feature called drop-in that you can just pick people who you want to be able to instantly connect with, and then you can just drop in, and then you appear on their screen, which I find a little creepy. But at the same time, when you think about older adults aging in place, not just devices like this, but there are a range of smart devices that can be really helpful to allow older adults to stay in their homes. Mental health management is probably one of the biggest that has seen growth in recent years. So there's over 10,000 apps in app stores that are focused on people's mental health. Obviously, this raises really important questions because of the sensitivity of mental health data. And so if we think about what are some of the questions and considerations when we're talking about research, where we're collecting this, again, potentially very sensitive data about users that's granular, could be over an extensive period of time, that can be used to build various types of predictive models. Here are 6 considerations that I tend to think about when we're talking about this type of research. So I'm going to talk about these all in more depth, but the 6 I think of are meaningful, informed consent, data quality, data sources, data access, social media considerations in particular, simply because it is incredibly popular in terms of data collection, obviously privacy and security considerations, and then thinking about data analysis and data-driven decision making. So when we're thinking about informed and meaningful consent, we all know on this call that consent documents tend to be long, they can be hard to interpret. If you're doing medical research, which I never have, but I have participated in medical research before, when I remember getting a 30-page consent document. Consent documents are challenging for even the most straightforward research. But when you're doing them on a mobile device, if we have ever added an app on our phone and we get that pop-up with the terms of use, probably most, if not all of us, are just scrolling or trying to get to that accept button. And so getting people to engage with these documents is even harder, I believe, because of the restrictions when you're displaying that on a mobile device. Obviously, if you're getting participation in a study like this, you can do hard copies beforehand rather than doing it all on mobile devices. But when you're having any types of approvals on a mobile device, people have been trained to really kind of ignore it. The challenge with, again, any research like this, but especially longitudinal research, is what I always call the set it and forget it method, in which you get consent at the beginning of a study. But if that study is going on for 6 months or some indeterminate amount of time, or it's going to be collecting data in the background, it's very easy for the person who consented to very quickly forget about that. And so thinking through, well, do you want to have consent be an ongoing process is something that I've seen more and more people talk about. So this could be mechanisms for reminding participants about their data collection, asking them to kind of re-up their consent, or if they want to change their consent at different times, making it simple and easy for people who do want to pause or end data collection. And, in an ideal world, you allow people to be able to review the data that they have been sharing and give them mechanisms to delete parts or all of it. When we think about collecting and analyzing platform data, and again, social media data is what we see tons of times, one of the challenges here is that this type of data collection going onto a platform and scraping data is typically characterized as non-human subjects data. And from my perspective, this is not necessarily a problem for IRBs, But for me, I think this means that this type of research needs a separate review. And what that looks like, I think I'm not 100% sure about, but because of this, a lot of researchers may assume that because it's, quote, not non-human subjects data, they don't need to worry about it. And I would disagree. That is some kind of ethical stamp because it doesn't need to go through IRB review. Obviously, social media data can provide very rich, large data sites with a wide range of data, not just health data, but all types of data, frequently used to train algorithms. Social media data is. And I put a screenshot of a paper we published 2 years ago in which we were looking at end users' attitudes toward their data being used as part of research across 3 platforms. So we looked at dating apps, we looked at Instagram, we looked at Reddit, and in a separate paper, we looked at Facebook. And what we found is that overall, users have a lot of concerns with their data being used for unexpected purposes. And most users are only viewing that data and how that data could be used in a pretty narrow way. Oh, they want to improve the usability of the site. That's completely fine. Not that various researchers are going to come in and they're going to try to build some type of model to predict X, Y, Z. For privacy and security challenges, obviously, social media platforms, mobile devices, wearables, all of these types of technologies are collecting a lot of data. As I said before, they're collecting it often in the background. You're not super conscious of that data being collected. Informed consent may not be able to sufficiently capture potential harms, assuming that there is an informed consent process at all. And then I think it's really important, again and again, we've seen that there's this belief that, oh, it's public data, and therefore it's a free-for-all. And that's not how the users of these platforms, the users of these devices think about it. And that's really important to understand what their beliefs are, not like this narrow interpretation of, well, legally, they click the I agree button, then it's okay. I think it's really important to stress data minimization as an important principle in any research, but especially when you are potentially collecting a large quantity of data over a large period of time that might be somewhat sensitive. And then thinking about data donation as an alternative, where people are voluntarily choosing to share their data and they maybe have a lot more control over it, could be a good alternative to just getting people to sign up for a study where you're going to be pulling data for a month or some period of time. Obviously, there are challenges with doing that also, but it's a great model in theory. And then finally, building predictive models. This is the one that I think is kind of the most important for us to be turning our attention to at this point in time. So there's lots of interest, especially in the health space, but in lots of spaces, for using this type of data to build models, to predict outcomes, to help people be healthier and all of those things. So I think it's really important for researchers to be careful considering how these models may be biased. And from our new grant, a lot of our attention is going to be focused on this because I don't think most researchers are getting a lot of training in this space. And so, when you're a grad student and you're going to be going out and getting an industry job, if we can help you figure out what questions should I be asking, what considerations should I be including in my determination, and realizing that sometimes it's best not to build a model at all. I think that's really hard for a lot of people. So what can we do to help researchers address these types of challenges? I'm going to very briefly share 2 examples, and then we can talk more about this in the Q&A. So the first would be focusing on scenario-based training. And so I'm pulling this from research being done by Dr. Sherry Pagoto at UConn. And so what she's been doing for the last several years is thinking about, well, in clinical trials research, how can we help those researchers be able to better identify potential harms or threats to research participants when they're doing it? And so they've been developing this scenario-based training, giving these various scenarios that a lot of them are gray, and then asking people to work through and try to assess, are there actually harms? What are they? How can you mitigate those harms? And then something that we did as part of Pervade is we built a decision support tool. And recognizing the complexity and nuance involved in any type of ethical decision making, what this does is it allows you, the researcher, to go in and to share some details about the type of research you're doing, what data you're collecting, and then it will give you customized feedback for either questions you should be asking of your data and your research and or resources. So it could be links to external guidelines, things like that, to help people, again, who often don't get formal training in school or on the job for how to engage in ethical assessments of an algorithm, of a study, those types of things, to give them opportunities and point them in the right direction. And so I want to wrap it up there, but if you do want to check out more about the Pervade group, you can visit pervade.umd.edu. The website is in the process of being updated, so more information will be added soon, but I just want to acknowledge that the research I've talked about here was supported by 2 NSF grants, and after the next talk, I am happy to answer any questions. So thank you.
Hey, let me see if I can share my screen now. There we go. Can you see that okay? Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Vitek. Wonderful talk. And I think this will be I think some of the things will be a pretty nice segue actually into some of the things that I'm going to talk about. So hi, everyone. I'm Benji Silverman. I'm the Senior IRB Chair for Mass General Brigham. I have some other roles too, but I think that's probably the one that's most relevant to this work and the way that I kind of think about some of these things. And so I'm going to go through some slides as well, and then really look forward to having a chance to hopefully have some discussion. I'll try to move through this. I'm going to keep my clock on. I'll try to move through this relatively quickly. So I'm going to talk about kind of this question of how does the use of AI in research test our notions of personal privacy and identifiability of data. Just to start by talking a little bit about use of AI in research. The first thing, I almost added a slide in here, but I trying to delete slides, not add slides. And, I think the first thing that's always important to just say is one AI is not another AI. We mean so many different things when we use the phrase AI. And I actually think a lot of the work we do with AI does not actually necessarily bring up any unique ethical considerations and is kind of very similar to, bread and butter things that we're used to. And then other types of AI bring up, lots of unique things. Because of the not having time, we're not going to kind of get into the nitty-gritty of all the different types of AI and things of this nature, but just to kind of say at a high level that most AI projects, I'd say almost all AI projects, start with the use of large data sets. So they're using medical records, building, training, and validating an AI model. I included here just kind of a sample AI lifecycle model. This often includes data sharing. It often requires data sharing and combining of lots of different data sets. And there's kind of this general perspective that more data are better, especially in light of some of the things that Dr. Vitek mentioned regarding bias and this concept of needing to make sure we have representative data sets, which means, again, combining data sets and more data and data sharing and more data being better. And then what we find is essentially that this AI model development process poses unique challenges related to privacy and confidentiality and transparency about data use. So I'm going to kind of walk through some of those today. Just to take a step back, I always kind of like to start with just the question of, well, why do IRBs care about this? Why do we care about the identifiability of data? And essentially, there's 2 answers. I think there's ethical duties and there's regulatory requirements. So our ethical duties, I think this is probably very basic for this audience, but just to remind you all, our ethical requirement for respect for persons or ethical principle of autonomy from the Belmont Report. In the context of what we're talking about here, essentially, I think means agency to decide how our data is used. So agency to decide how our identifiable data is collected, used, stored, shared, etc. Our recently revised Declaration of Helsinki includes a duty to protect the privacy of research participants and the confidentiality of their personal information. So this is kind of at the center of everything that we do. That's part of why IRBs care. And then the question as to how do we meet those duties? So generally speaking, the duty for autonomy we meet through consent by requiring consent for identifiable data use and sharing, and then maintaining appropriate essentially data use and data stewardship and data storage. On the regulatory side, we have the common rule. One of the main reasons we care about this, and Dr. Vitek mentioned this, and I think is really important, and we can talk more about it, is the distinction between what is human subjects research and what is not human subjects research under the common rule is entirely defined essentially by identifiability. It's worth noting, of course, that identifiability distinction may no longer be relevant for FDA-regulated software as medical device research. And so that's something that I know IRBs really struggle with as we kind of think about this work. But this is part of the reason IRBs care so much about identifiability is basically, is this something that the IRB has to review or not? Or is there, right, some other pathway? And then when it is under the auspices of IRB review, the criteria for IRB review of research, the criteria for approval, I think both minimizing risks to subjects and then, of course, having adequate provisions to protect privacy and confidentiality are, again, reasons why we care about identifiability. And again, kind of how do we achieve those regulatory requirements? Generally speaking, minimizing risks to subjects includes minimum necessary data use, so only accessing and storing and sharing and using data that is absolutely necessary to use for the purposes of the research. We try to de-identify and anonymize data when possible, and again, through appropriate data use stewardship and storage. And so, as I mentioned, AI kind of challenges the methods that the safeguards that IRBs typically rely on to meet those ethical and regulatory requirements. So some of the things I just mentioned, minimum necessary data use, de-identifying and anonymizing data, and consent for identifiable data use and sharing, I think are all very challenging in the context of, cutting edge AI work. As I said, with AI, more data are better. So this concept of kind of minimum necessary is really totally thrown on its head, and it's hard to know what to do with that. With AI, I'm going to ask the question of, is de-identification even still possible? And so is this whole thing resting on a concept that is basically potentially archaic? And then consent. So we have to ask the question that I think with consent, if we're trying to get consent for these large data sets for AI development, it may actually lead to less representative data sets and more biased algorithms. So there's some real challenges and trade-offs that we have to think about as we think about how we kind of approach the things we normally do in our day-to-day work and how that applies to when we start to approach protocols using AI. So just to talk a little bit more about how AI changes our conceptions of identifiability or re-identifiability, and to try to kind of answer the question I just raised a couple minutes ago around, is de-identification really even still possible now? Just to say, so how we define identifiability, again, kind of focusing on the common rule. The common rule allows judgment essentially for what is identifiable or not. The common rule says it's private information for which the identity of the subject is or may be readily ascertained by the investigator or associated with the information. So may be readily ascertained is kind of vague, right? And so there's a question as to how you determine whether it could be readily ascertained or not. And I think it's quite common that reasonable people will disagree on that, so that you'll have someone who thinks a data set may be able to readily ascertain the identity of a participant, and someone else who may feel the opposite. And yet, the problem is the common rule, again, forces us into a binary decision. So this kind of vague concept, but a binary decision around, well, do we think it's identifiable or not? Do we think it's human subjects research or not? And so because of what I said, where reasonable people can disagree, what you end up finding with identifiability in the common rule is if you take two different IRBs, and here the blue is, kind of the data sets that that IRB would say are identifiable, and the clear or just the empty square is the data sets that the IRB would say are not identifiable, and they draw their lines in different places, basically. So taking the same data set and you ask IRB1, is this identifiable or not? And IRB2, and you get two different answers. And the problem is, of course, because the reality is that this is on a continuum. The reality is this concept of maybe readily identifiable. It's really hard to actually de-identify something, and part of whether it's readily ascertainable or not depends on how much work you do to reverse engineer it. And so the reality is that most of our data sets are probably on a continuum where it's not a black and white answer as to whether they are or are not identifiable. And as one of my mentors likes to say, it kind of goes like this. It's, pretty much identifiable, sort of identifiable, maybe identifiable, not very identifiable, pretty much not identifiable. And so, again, the binary decision and the kind of judgment that goes into this, leaves a lot of room for interpretation. And so just to say right now, so even before AI, when we just talk about kind of what is the challenge with identifiability, is essentially that the data can be that data can be re-identified, right? So this question of, can data be de-identified at all? So methods of de-identification we delete key data points, we can obfuscate or transform data, we can code or link data, we can try to anonymize data, and it's all challenged basically by the science of re-identification. The basic idea behind the science of re-identification is you're using data, auxiliary information, so information outside of the data set, to essentially link two different data sets, something that people call the data mosaic effect. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. But basically, the idea is you can have a de-identified data set that has no identifiers in it, but then you can have another data set that has identifiers, and if they have a common variable, you can put the two together, right? And all of a sudden, the data set that was de-identified is no longer de-identified. And by doing this, Latanya Sweeney kind of, I think, really was a founder and leader in a lot of this work. This is very old at this point, but back from the 1990 census data, you could identify essentially 87% of the population based on three demographic characteristics. And 53% using, slightly zoomed out demographics. And this is before AI. This is just kind of manually combining data sets. And so the problem is that AI basically takes that science of re-identification and puts it on steroids. It kind of increases the ease with which this can be done. AI, I'd say, increases the probability of re-identification. It amplifies the power of that data mosaic effect. Basically, it's there's enhanced pattern recognition. So instead of having to manually do this, the AI can just go through and compare all the possible data sets in the world and see where this overlap is. This is the top image here is kind of what I was describing before, where you're just looking for that overlap between the two data sets. So you can do that faster, you can do that more accurately. And then I think one of the more scary things is actually, you can make connections between seemingly disconnected data sets. So the bottom image here, these are two data sets that do not actually have an overlapping a variable in common. And yet people were still able to link them by essentially looking at the behavior of the data and looking at kind of all of the things that surround the data. AI is able to draw conclusions and link data sets, even when there's kind of not an obvious link potentially to, a human being looking at those two data sets. So that is, I think, kind of very frightening when we think about the potential for re-identification. And essentially this concept that information that has been anonymized and scrubbed of all identifiers can actually now be re-identified with some of these emerging AI strategies. There was a paper, again, and this is, again, old now at this point, right? 5 years old is very old in, I think, the AI world. But in 2019, generative AI models were able to correctly re-identify 99.98% of the people in Massachusetts using 15 demographic attributes. So really, just to say the power of this computing, it just kind of is remarkable in terms of the power of re-identification. And the other thing that I think is worth noting is that, like, and these are not, we talk a lot about re-identification of like genomic samples and things like that. And, maybe there's a few people in the world that have the right technology to really be able to reverse engineer, but this technology to do this kind of reverse engineering is actually quite readily available. And so that is also part of the challenge is anyone can probably do some of this work. So the new reality now of identifiability with generative AI may be this third column, that it is possible that with AI, we actually just want to say this is all identifiable, and we can't take that de-identified path and kind of, as Dr. Vitek said earlier, maybe we can't have that kind of cop out of of non-human subjects research where it doesn't get any review, and that is another path potentially as in addition to kind of creating a separate committee to review that type of work. So just to kind of summarize some of what I just said, I think relying on de-identifying and anonymizing data as a method to safeguard or minimize risks may actually now provide us a false sense of security. We may actually think we're doing something that we're not. NHSR determinations may no longer be a plausible path for research that's going to use generative AI models or has the ability to be acted upon by generative AI models. This, by the way, is why most academic medical centers prohibit entry of any de-identified or anonymous data into public generative AI platforms. I think everyone kind of obviously understands why we don't put protected health information into them, but people always ask me, well, why can't I put in de-identified information? And it's just this. It's basically that the power of the connecting of the databases. It's not clear that there is anything that is actually de-identified or anonymous. And so then finally, if we take this stance, if you agree with some of the argument that I made, and we say, okay, we can't de-identify any of this, I think then it gets back to the question of, well, what do we do about consent? Because usually when we are using identifiable data, we would want to get consent. And so we would then have to ask the question of should we be working toward the creation of some sort of large consented data sets for AI model development. And so I'm going to wrap up by just kind of then talking about the possible implications of that. If we said, okay, we are going to try to get consent for identifiable data use and sharing in AI research, there's benefits and there are risks. So there's the benefits are we improve transparency about data use, respect for persons, and autonomy and agency of our research participants. I think it mirrors consent requirements in other areas, as I mentioned, kind of other potentially identifiable areas. So we have consent requirements for future use and broad data sharing under the NIH genomic data sharing policy. The common rule requires considerations for consent for whole genome sequencing. It's the kind of this idea that if you're doing things that may end up being potentially identifiable, we really should be thinking about consent. On the other hand, there's real risks when it comes to AI work. It's certainly just impracticable for the large data sets that are required for good AI model development. And then I think more to the point, kind of as Dr. Vitek laid out a little bit, is that it would likely result in reduced data quality and less diverse data sets. And so we may think that we're doing something good, but this could actually lead to the potential to have more data bias and worsen algorithmic bias from subsequently developed models and ultimately create bigger justice concerns. So I think like anything, we end up potentially having to weigh one ethical principle against another. Just to kind of underscore this, the most recent data I saw on this was there was a 2024 OIG report that was looking at completed trials. And of the trials they looked at, 10 out of the 12 trials did not meet their enrollment targets for underrepresented populations. So we know this is still a problem. And if you build in consent requirements, your data sets are just essentially going to be less diverse just because of what we know about the way research works these days. And I'm just going to wrap up quickly just by talking a little bit of a regulatory aside. But so if we don't get consent, you can ask the question of, well, do the waiver of consent for data sharing in AI research, can we meet the requirements for a waiver or alteration of consent? Again, this is probably familiar to you all, but I just put up here quickly the criteria for waiving or altering consent. So no more than minimal risk, cannot be practically be carried out. Cannot be practically carried out without such information, doesn't adversely affect the rights and welfare of the subjects, and then whenever appropriate, we provide people with additional pertinent information afterwards, just to kind of go through this. So no more than minimal risk. We could argue that the use of data for AI development is already a part of our daily lives, right? We're all carrying around phones that are collecting data. Dr. Vitek showed, all the data that gets collected about us. And maybe this is already just too late, and this is part of our daily lives, and it's minimal risk, and we shouldn't worry about it. I think the impracticability part, I think, is fairly obvious that the huge number of data that are needed would make this very, very challenging. De-identification can and should be carried out, but again, may not actually be possible. Again, I think risk to privacy can potentially be minimized through appropriate data use, stewardship, sharing, and storage. And then, generally, we're not requiring any kind of additional information to be provided when we're talking about secondary data use. And so just to say, this is what we do right now, right? So I'm raising all these questions and kind of thinking about the future and, where should we be heading? But right now we do this routinely, right? So we routinely waive consent for secondary use of data for AI model development. And I think these are the way we kind of justify that. And I just want to underline this one. Just keep this one in your mind for 1 second, because I'm going to come back to this before I wrap up this question about will it adversely affect the rights and welfare of the subjects. And then we also have to do HIPAA waivers in addition to our consent waiver. So again, here are the requirements for a waiver of authorization of the privacy rule. Not going to read it all to you, but again, essentially no more than minimal risk, could not be practically carried out. And so again, and again, we do this all the time right now. We waive both HIPAA and consent. We justify it by saying that there's appropriate data stewardship, that it's impracticable, and that these large data sets are required. Now, again, I want to just underscore something here for the HIPAA waiver. I think this is actually potentially even more challenging than the consent waiver, is that the HIPAA waiver requires an adequate plan to destroy the identifiers at the earliest opportunity consistent with the conduct of the research. So I just want to kind of end with one more point, which is essentially the problem with generative AI and HIPAA waivers and some of that language that I just underscored, which is if you train a generative AI model on identifiable information, that identifiable information may be retained within the model, and it is possible that you could get the model to spit out that information, which could include the training data. So this was an example from a year or so ago with ChatGPT, where essentially I don't know, I'll use the word hackers, I guess, basically figured out a way. And at that time, this has been fixed, but at that time, if you told it to repeat the word forever, poem, 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 that if you just kept doing it, at some point you got identifiable information from the data sets that were used to train. And so if you think about if you fed all of your medical records into some sort of algorithm to train it, it is possible that protected health information would be retained and could potentially be spit out. And so we make ourselves feel comfortable on the HIPAA waiver thing usually by saying, well, everything's being done within our hospital system, right? It's on our servers, it's on our infrastructure. But the question that I like to raise is, well, what's going to happen afterwards, right? So usually there's some sort of goal. There's post-research deployment or distribution or commercialization. Are you going to put this out there? Will people be able to get this information to be spit out? And then kind of to the waiver points I mentioned earlier, does this adversely affect the rights and welfare of the participants from whom the data was obtained? Can the identifiers actually ever be destroyed? Can improper disclosure or training data be prevented? So I think, when you start really getting the weeds on some of this, you can, I think, easily talk yourself into the idea that we can't grant those waivers. But again, there's kind of no perfect world. So we're kind of trying to decide, which risks we want to take. So just to wrap up, the take-home points, AI model development requires large representative data sets. They're usually trained on medical records, usually accessed again right now under a waiver of consent and HIPAA waiver. Generative AI and emerging AI strategies challenge our understandings about personal privacy and identifiability of data. It may no longer be possible to truly identify data in the context of emerging AI technologies. I think researchers and HRPPs and IRBs need to be thinking about new ways to minimize risks when using this data, and again, may need to adjust our review pathways accordingly. Maybe none of these can go down the NHSR path. For these large data sets, there's the real tension between the possible benefits of requiring consent and the potential for less representation and more bias and discrimination. And then I think at the end of the day, the place I always come back to is this last bullet point here, which is I think beyond consent. Really, I think what we need to be doing is essentially public notification and education about what we do, about how we use people's personal and medical data for research. I think that's ultimately how we enhance transparency and trust and meet our ethical duties to our patients and participants. And just to say that's not exclusive to AI model development, I think we need to be doing that more across the board in terms of how we use the data and samples of our patients and participants. So I will wrap up there and hopefully left a little time for questions.
Absolutely. I appreciate it so much. I know some of you are sitting there like, wow, I wish I could just talk to them and ask them questions all the time and them sit beside me at my computer and just tell me what to do. So I will open the floor now if anybody wants to put a question into the chat or turn on your cameras and ask a question directly. I think Dr. Sloopner asked one in the chat. Is Dr. Sloopner on the call if he wants to turn on his camera?
I also have to turn off. Like, um, hi, I'm Charlie Schluter. I'm IRB chair with Korean Clinic. The first point I made is one of the things that we've become sensitive to is eliminating DOB and just adding age, which makes it much more difficult to re-identify, I would think. And reflections on your part, you agree, or?
I would agree with that. Dr.
Yeah.
Vitek, what do you think?
I would too.
And it also seems to me that ultimately, I've been IRB chair for about 12 years, okay? And I've watched some evolution. In addition to, I'm a viral immunologist, and I've done antiviral work prior to this for a long time. So I have the perspective of a prior researcher while at the same time being chair. It seems to me our priority has to be that the protection of the subject, and I said this in my second chat comment, Hillary, has to supersede any dedication, if you will, to the quality of an AI model. My bias would be the hell with the quality if I'm sacrificing someone's safety, whatever, because hopefully all of us are benevolent, but there are a hell of a lot of people out there who are malevolent. Comment, thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is one of the motivations for me to say we need a separate entity to be evaluating this technology, and it shouldn't be IRB's job, because I think IRBs are relatively clearly defined, and let's not add more to their to what they need to be able to test and what expertise they need to be developing, because I do think that is a very different type of assessment. So yes, I think it needs to be happening, because what I see is there's just a lot of people doing research and like, we built this algorithm that can predict, the very well-known example, the GADAR algorithm. Like, we can predict through somebody's Facebook profile pictures whether, what their sexuality is. And it's like, should that research actually have been done at all? Like, did they actually stop to think whether it should be done, because it's illegal in many countries in the world to be gay? And then, you could see certain governments using that as a way to arrest people, prosecute people.
Yeah.
My guess is they never thought that. What you hear when you do interviews with a lot of these researchers is, I just wanted to see if it could be done. I just wanted to see if I could build an accurate model. It's like, no, that is not where the line is. But again, I think we need some sort of separate entity from an IRB to be engaging in these evaluations.
Understood.
Yeah. And I would echo that. I actually totally agree. I when I was preparing for the talk, I wasn't sure which talk to give exactly, and so I gave this talk because I thought it was kind of more interesting and intellectually stimulating. But I've given other talks and have thought a lot about just like the institutional infrastructure for reviewing this type of work and what is the IRB's job, what is not the IRB's job. And I do think that most people I've talked to are settling on exactly kind of what Dr. Vitek described, which is essentially that we need a broader institutional approach to really doing a good job of reviewing some of this work. I would actually take it even a step further and say, even if we wanted the IRB to do it, I don't think the IRB can. The IRB doesn't have the expertise. The IRB doesn't actually it's not like the IRB gets a copy of the algorithm, even if they wanted to do a bias check, right? Like we don't actually, we couldn't do it even if we wanted to. There are some models for this. Stanford has I think it's a Science and Society review or something of that sort, where they're doing like an ancillary review that's trying to look at, right, should we be doing this work and the bias potential and things like this. I think UCSF is trying to stand up something similar. Other institutions my institution, we have kind of an AI governance committee that we're trying to kind of build in and trying to figure out, how it all kind of flows together. The challenge, of course, is triage. Basically, the challenge is kind of like if you take, I think at some point, every single one of our research studies is going to be an AI research study, right? And so not every single one of them can go to this other committee. And so, where you make the choices around what needs this closer look for some of these, bigger picture concerns versus what is more bread and butter is, I think, very challenging. But
I mean, maybe it could be done by an IRB subcommittee that is made up of gurus and IT. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
I mean, this is why I'm excited about the NTIA doing this request for comments on this, because I do think that's a really useful step in the right direction. But the Pervade team itself has gotten so many asks over the years to basically serve in this role, and we're like, we all have day jobs. We can't just be doing ethics consulting for the future, that we would have to all quit our jobs. So, I think that it is a promising step in the right direction for recognizing that there isn't any there's no infrastructure in place already that can provide guidance, recommendations, evaluation for this type of research in particular.
Lest it go unsaid, I probably should have introduced my comments by saying thank you, because I enjoyed it. Was a stimulating discussion. I did a journal club recently for our faculty advancement group and about AI and its influence on healthcare. And I'm not a guru in this area, so I'm very much learning, but you guys did a nice job. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's kind of a nice segue into one of the questions I received earlier. What role do you see for public and higher education in building trust around AI research using medical data? What specific educational strategies have the two of you found that are effective?
Oh, that's a great question.
It is a great question. I think it's also relevant to a lot of people who we have today, because we work with so many, medical students and even fellows and residents, to where they're growing up with AI and are used to using it. And so we're trying to model a great way. And so, what have you found effective, or how do you build trust there and understand it's a tool?
Do you want to go first, Dr. Silverman?
You can go first.
Okay. So I think one thing that we need to be really careful with, that we have already seen, is the narrative that emerged, 10, 15 years ago about digital natives, and that, kids today, they've been growing up with the internet, so they just kind of like by osmosis, they know this stuff. And what we found was actually, no, that is not the case. We should not just be assuming that they have a really strong understanding or are able to identify privacy and ethical risks or other types of threats to using that technology. So building this into public education, so I actually had a grant that wrapped up earlier this year that was focused on beginning education and how to scaffold education starting in kindergarten to start bringing up issues around privacy, security, safety, AI, digital citizenship, those types of things, and really connecting it to like young kids' daily lived experiences, which surprisingly they have a lot starting very young that you can pull in to do this. And so I do think that this needs to be standardized, kind of what's happened with social and emotional learning in the last decade or so in schools, that you're also having this component so that they're just getting the vocabulary. They know what types of questions to ask, those things. I think that's really important. What we're hoping to do in the next 3 years with this NSF grant we got is to build out a suite, a toolkit of all types of resources for grad students who are doing research, who are going to go into the field, for researchers themselves and how, like in their own lab, talking about this. Because I think a lot of people, if you have some PhD who has a lab, has a bunch of students working for them, and they never went through this process, they may not even know where to start or how to frame it. So that's really helpful. But I think something Dr. Silverman said earlier was, just making this more part of the public conversation and demystifying it, because what I've seen over the years and again and again and again is people are like, that's too complicated. I couldn't possibly understand that. And that makes it mystical, which makes it so much harder for people to then be able to assess. They just kind of jump to conclusions, make assumptions. And so we really want to demystify this and help people make more informed decisions regarding their use of what they use, how they use it, what they share, what they put into a ChatGPT prompt, those types of things.
That was a great answer. I totally agree and look forward to using your educational tools you create. All I would do is, kind of reiterate the last point I think I made, which is, from the standpoint of an academic medical center, I think we do not do a very good job at educating our patients about what happens when they come to the hospital with their data and their samples, right? And it actually nothing to do with AI. I'm just talking at a very broad level. I think many people don't realize that we grant waivers of consent to use their data and tissues for research, right? And I appreciate it's a very delicate conversation to have, right? Like how you have that conversation, especially given what I said earlier around, and we know that lots of people don't want to participate in research, and certain groups of people participate in research less than other groups, right? And so how you have these conversations to say, well, this is happening anyway, basically, and by the way, the reason it's happening anyway is because this is really important for science. It's really important for health. You and your communities will benefit from the discoveries that we make, right? This is part of our mission, basically, right? And I think having that conversation more is what we need to do. And then I think AI is just a part of that, essentially, because then you layer on all these other complexities. But I think that's what we need more of, is kind of education around what our mission is, how we accomplish that mission, and having the difficult conversations about, what research is, and why somebody does or doesn't want to participate, and why we do it, and why we do things under waiver of consent and why that's allowed, right? I think having all of those difficult conversations is what we need to do. I don't have a great example of having done it yet, but it's something that I think we need to be, heading in that direction.
Thank you. Thank you. All good answers and food for thought. We have about 3 minutes left. If anyone has any other questions you want to ask before we close, please go ahead or type it in the chat. If anybody just wants to talk and thank them for their time and expertise and ask about any direct questions about the work they do. Wonderful information in the chat. It absolutely is. Definitely gets you thinking for sure. That's why I wanted them as speakers, because you walk away and it gives you food for thought and stuff to reference. And I did record. Hopefully everything goes well with the recording, and they were nice enough to share their presentations with us as well. So I will share that information. If no one has any questions, then I hope that you enjoyed this session, and please let me know if you have any questions or any comments. But thank you all for attending today.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having